Hello. So today is in bulk, the calendar in bulk, February the 1st. And I am so happy to be joined by the amazing Christen to talk about like soul retrieval, finding our own souls in like the kitchen, in Hecate's kitchen, and really diving into our, I guess you'd call it a project
Mm-hmm.
that we're doing, really like deep diving into the ancient practice of leaving Hecate supper at the crossroads. So we're finding soul through exploring like this ancient practice and talking about the hearth, how we find our own souls in the kitchen and cooking and kitchen witchery and so on. And we're recording this, like I said, on February the 1st, which is also like in Covina why we're exploring like Psychopomp and getting ready for soul retrieval. And for me, I wanted to talk to Christen because I think she's like me in that she really feels like the kitchen is the soul of the home and a place to like express her own soul. I don't know. I think we're going to have a lot of fun talking about this. So we're going to do our opening little ritual that we do. So if you've got a candle or your hands, you can grab that now. And then we'll just cast the circle counterclockwise, just cleansing the space. And then we'll cast the circle around in a clockwise manner, connecting us and protecting and nourishing us. So I knew I wanted to talk to you about soul retrieval because I know you've had some really powerful experiences in the past of calling back bits of yourself. So I'm super excited that you're here. Maybe I'll just read the poem from the beginning of chapter 12 in Entering Hecate's Cave to kind of set the energy and serve as our invocation for our chat. At this crossroads, the end of a long journey, I am no longer seduced by the past, nor am I fooled by the hollow promise of the well-lit path. It is the deepest darkness that I seek, guided only by distant torchlight, the mistress of souls, my only companion. Each step has been my own. I am here to reclaim what is mine. Pieces of me that found refuge in her dark womb after the cruelty and violence of those who preyed on my weakness. They are dead to me now, slain by my will to heal. How her wheel has turned. Now I keep my own keys. I have returned home. Into the welcoming darkness I tread, the very heart of Hecate's realm. So Hecate's role as Psychopomp is really connected to like food and the kitchen and all of this business. Like it's really interesting. And I think like we have a really personal connection to all of this, but there's also the really fascinating history. So Christen and I are starting a project really understand like contextualizing, doing like a social anthropology on the ancient Hecate suppers, really understanding what the ingredients meant, how they would get the ingredients, really like going deep into all the different ingredients of this. And I certainly find that very soulful. And I feel like it's a bit like being a culinary psychopomp
Oh yeah.
because you know what I mean? Because it's like the idea of offering Hecate a meal on the dark moon or the astronomical new moon has become like a central practice, I would say, of a lot of Hecateans.
Mhm.
So it's like, as we do this connecting to Hecate, whose, role as the psychopomp was certainly like one of her most ancient and enduring roles, that so we're taking this offering out to her at the crossroads after dark. Um, and like, it's such a beautiful contemporary practice, and it has this like mysterious, very psychopompic origin story, like about what it was 2,000 years ago.
So I'm thinking about what you said about culinary psychopomp, and I read something really beautiful today that was talking about like the spirits of our kitchen or the hearth of our home, and that cooking is essentially a conversation between the dead and the living, and it binds us through like ancestral ties. And even, like with a dip nine, that, there's a lineage there that goes back to, antiquity, ancient times, that I think is just so beautiful. And just, I don't know how to explain, like to be a part of that is just,
Yeah, it's really like it's hard to find the right words for it. We
yeah.
will. This is why we're working on this, because we're like really enchanted by it, and also like I'm really enchanted by my own relationship with food, because like I said in a recent episode, like I've had an eating disorder most of my life, and for me, like, to see food as like sacred and a way to the soul, like for me over the last decade, that's been super healing. And to not see food as the enemy, like I kind of saw it most of my life, that food was the problem and
Mhm.
not like a source of nourishment, like you said, or of connecting to your ancestors, that it was just a big problem that needed to be done away with. So for me, and part of my like my own return to my own soul has been to develop this healthy relationship with food. And like you said, and food, like when we are making food, like we are connecting to the dead, um, in so many ways, because whether it's like family recipes, like, I make cornbread, a cornbread recipe that's been in my family for a long time, or the way I make tea biscuits. Every family, I think, has a different way of making tea biscuits, like a different recipe. Like, I would never put eggs in my tea biscuits. Would you?
No, absolutely not.
But some people, I have heard some people put eggs in their tea biscuits. I have seen it in my own kitchen. I had a friend over and she's like, "Oh, I'll make the biscuits." And I was like, what are you making?"
No judgment.
No judgment, but just explain to me what's happening. So like there's that whole thing about when we're preparing food, we are connecting to something like that's gone before us and that got us to where we are today. And
Mhm.
even like I think about this a lot because we eat animals a little bit around here. I mean, not necessarily my favorite thing, but we do. And to be like mindful of like that animal sacrifice so you could have food, which to me reminds me of like, like this, humans have been slaughtering and eating animals all around the planet since humans became humans. So, just all of that kind of history, or even like when something simple like the blood, sweat, and toil that brings like vegetables to the table. Not mine. Well, I mean, I grow some things, but like there's so much richness to food, and something I really appreciate, are like authors like Michael Pollan and others who write these books, making me think about food. Does that make sense? Like think about food in different ways, like forks over knives, and um, I mean, he even has a book out on the history of caffeine.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. There's so much to just bring into like conscious awareness about food, and the fact that there is like this existing documentation that really describes in great detail like this act of um, propitiating Hecate on the dark moon with a very specific type of supper, and that it's become so much a part of like modern Hecatean practice. I find the whole thing really super fascinating, and a way, certainly a way for me back to my own soul.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and in my new book, Entering Hecate's Cave, I talk about soul retrieval, and there's a soul retrieval ritual. So I want us, Christen, though, to mostly land on, I guess, how like we experience soul retrieval, like both within like a ritual format, but also like spontaneous moments when we know that a piece of us was missing have come back.
Mm-hmm. I feel like I'm very much in a period of soul retrieval right now in the sense of all of these things that we're working on. I'm a chef, right? I'm a career chef. I've been doing this for 20 years. And I woke up this morning thinking about this in myself, and I think outwardly too. There is a little bit of disconnect in the modern world. Like when you think about the kitchen as the hearth of the home, like the hearth, this is like the center of the home, right?
Yeah.
Um, and it's like to be a cook, to be kind of at the head of the kitchen, you're spreading nourishment, like you're spreading actual nourishment, you're spreading soul nourishment. Like these are things I know in my head, but being in this career for so long, I think, you, especially as a woman, because it's a very male dominated field, let's be honest, and just put that on the table because it's the thing. You can get so lost in sort of, ego, uh, and just kind of lose the depth and meaning of what it means to cook, to be in the kitchen, to stand at the hearth. And I think for me, I'm finding this really strong connect between the sacred and the mundane, and like my soul fire as reflected in the hearth of the home, and like uh how I'm offering nourishment, like spiritually and like literally. And it's just ringing really, really strongly in my head and heart right now.
Oh, that's so interesting because you do this professionally.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
like you said, it's a male dominated career. Have you ever given any thought to like why there is this dichotomy between like we know from statistics that it's women who do most of the cooking at home,
Mm-hmm.
but yet as a profession at the executive level like you're at, it's almost all men. Have you ever thought about why that might be?
I don't think I've ever thought about why it might be, but I do think about it. And I think about, like my grandmother standing at the stove and everybody gathered around the table. And like that was like, I don't know, I think something along the lines, I think there's something when it crossed over from a position of like reverence to like a servant sort of thing. Does that make sense?
It does
Um,
make sense.
yeah, and I don't know, it's just sort of like patriarchal dominance. I don't, I don't know, but it's something to think about for
Yeah,
sure.
I never kind of quite thought of it like that either, but you're right. There's this whole thing where it's, the woman who is like at the hearth, like cooking the meals for the family and making sure they have food on the table. Like in some ways, it's like within the patriarchy, that role is really diminished. Yet, like she or whoever is that one is
Mhm.
the one who is literally making it possible for everyone around the table to make whatever their contribution is to society because she's there cooking. I'm thinking of like, when families would live together and maybe, had like a small, their own farm
Mhm.
And, you know, they would have their own animals to slaughter and maybe grow some of their own crops. And, you know, they were really like feeding themselves
Mhm.
and maybe getting a little food from outside, like from the markets and so on. But most of the food what came from nearby with, you know, maybe exotic spices. Because I mean, in our researches that we've been doing on the ancient Greeks and ancient Romans and their food, they certainly had a lot of exotic things that they had access to. Like, you know, they had spices and they didn't have ice cream, real ice cream, apparently. So I don't know, I keep thinking about that. It's like, no real ice cream. Well, so much for time traveling back to ancient Rome. Um, but, you know, you think about the hearth and what it would mean like for the average family and how like I guess starting with the industrial revolution when people, you know, when cities like I mean this really got started of course with the Greeks and amplified with the Romans, like the development of the city. So
Mhm.
like there's this kind of development of the city, and then there's also the more rural life, which would have been more like feeding yourself and you grow the stuff and you eat the stuff, but then there's a city life where that just really wouldn't have been possible. But kind of the common to both milieus would be like there is a woman in the kitchen at the hearth making the food, um, you know, like perhaps like going to market or slaughtering the animals, you know, cleaning the vegetables, maybe getting the vegetables, you know what I mean? Like all of this business was very connected to the feminine in the past, but it was home focused. So maybe when restaurants became more of a thing, because women weren't doing paid work, it became like the zone of like the elite French chef with his Michelin stars. And he went to the Cordon Bleu and he's wearing that funny little hat. It looks like the Pillsbury Doughboy. Like, you know what I mean? Or like Anthony Bourdain or Gordon Ramsay. Like, you know, you see these like huge superstar celebrity chefs today, and they're almost all men.
Mhm.
I mean, there's a few women who are kind of in that group, but not very, like they're not to the level of the men ones are.
Mhm.
And then there's a whole thing I think in our modern world, we're kind of like more so than ever, no matter like if we do live in a fairly like urban or suburban area, like we can function quite comfortably and you don't have to be super rich to kind of fix it so you almost never have to cook. Like I don't do that. I live in the country. We go out twice a month. I get excited. Kristen knows this. It's like twice a month we go and get supplies, and I get my ice cream and we get some kind of restaurant food. So I don't do this. But before we moved here, we did like live in the city, and I was a busy working mom with two kids, and it was super easy to just like not cook.
Right.
But since we moved here, cooking, because I like to eat really good food, cooking has become a really important part of my life and also an important part of my recovery.
Mhm.
And it's really just changed my whole orientation towards like food and where food comes from. And I'm not here to preach to anybody about what they should do with their own food habits or honoring, you know, it's like you do you when you come to that, like when you do you, because it's really complicated. Um, but maybe you could just maybe we could encourage them to just be a little bit mindful about how they find their own soul in their food, whether it's a favorite dish or
Mhm.
a favorite memory of eating when you were younger. I don't know.
100%. And to bring it back to what you were saying, I'm thinking about when I first entered this world. I think I read, like you brought up Anthony Bourdain, I read like Kitchen Confidential, and I just ran to the closest fine dining restaurant and I was like, let me in here, let me in here. I don't care what I have to do. I'll wash dishes, let me in. And so it was very rooted in like an ego thing. And like I wanted to prove myself. And like there's just this sense of like one up in each other, like being the best at this thing. And I don't know. But then now where I'm at, I think about like my grandmother. And she instilled a love of cooking in me. And I think about what you were saying. We were very rural, and we were kind of a family that, she would fish in the summer, and my dad or whoever would like hunt in the winter, and she was a gardener, and we had like a big 2-acre garden. And I remember like holding on to her apron strings like while she was just walking through the garden. She had this little pocket knife in her pocket, and she would like pull it out and just like cut, pull up a turnip and like peel it in the garden and hand me little pieces of it. And just there's something there, this soul reconnection, this whole like it's the closing the divide between like the sacred and the mundane for me right now at the hearth. That happens at the hearth.
It happens at the heart. It's interesting that you bring up your experience with your grandmother because I had like a really similar experience with my dad's mother. She lived like really remotely, and I would spend like a good chunk of my summers. I kind of got like put on the ferry and sent off to be with Nanny.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that was like my favorite time, and those are my favorite childhood memories. And I would just follow her around. She was working in the garden. My grandfather was a fisherman, so there would be like cod or haddock, and
Mm-hmm.
she would salt it, which is a really traditional thing from where I'm from in the world, is to have salt fish,
Mm-hmm.
which always freaked me out because anyway. And sometimes they would set up the smoker and they'd smoke fish, and I mean, and we would just do these things that, like, we would go and get. She always called them periwinkles, but
Mm-hmm.
little sea snails. And,
Mm-hmm.
just we would go and just get a whole bucket full of them, throw them in some boiling water, and then just take a darning needle and eat them. Like, that would be a meal. Like, she didn't go to the grocery store very often. Like, it wasn't when I was little, it wasn't in her purview to be like, we're going to go to the IGA because the IGA is like an hour and a half away.
Right.
And, so she would cook with what's on hand. And she never had an electric range in her whole life. Like, it was a
Oh
wood and
wow.
oil fired stove. So those are like my big cooking memories are of this huge stove that heated the house. She had a smaller, like more traditional potbelly, and like she had a summer kitchen too. But like she had this massive stove.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the fridge was like some kind of relic from the 1940s that I don't think she ever replaced. Um, and that to me, my mom was a busy mom. She was working full time. She had us and all the things. So we did have some special dishes that she would make. But when I think about like food, I think about, all my time with Nanny and really super simple food, tea biscuits with molasses,
Oh yeah.
you know, fresh potatoes with just cream, right from the garden. That's what I like, when I think about childhood food, I also think about, some of the things my mom made, but I just really connected to just going outside and like digging up some potatoes and eating them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there's something there about that soul nourishing experience, taking that experience and like turning it outward to nourish the people that you love or nourish others.
And now, like, I have a small garden. I grow mostly like leafy greens and herbs and things that the deer won't eat here because I haven't quite figured things out yet how to keep the deer out of the garden because they're very creative. They want their lettuce and they like their leafy greens and a lot of the vegetables. Anyway, so but for me, it's like a ritual when I go out to the garden. Even like now in the winter, well, it's gotten too cold here, but until it gets super cold, like I'll go out and like clip the thyme or clip lavender or clip oregano or just clip things. Um, or I'll go out and get like the kale and the Brussels sprout, like whatever it is. And to me, that feels so sacred. It feels so soulful. It also feels like a luxury.
Yeah.
Like look at me. I can just walk out my door and get myself some time. So and you grow quite a bit, and do you do some wild foraging too?
Oh yeah, I do. And my spouse actually, she's all into mushrooming.
Oh,
She's like
wow.
a daily thing, foraging for mushrooms. Yeah, really into wild foraging. And that's something else my grandmother did too. And it's funny because she was kind of, she was kind of like this old, old school Appalachian grandma, and like she knew all the secrets. And she would like bundle us up and we would go out in the woods and brave like copperheads and all kinds of stuff to gather like pawpaws and wild persimmons. And so yeah, that's something that she instilled in me also. That is very sacred in my world.
So maybe this has given like everyone just a little bit of an insight kind of where we're coming from with doing our Hecate's Kitchen and Hecate's Supper project. So it's something we've just been working on. I guess we got started last summer with the cakes for Hecate,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and that was so interesting just learning like how the ancient Greeks and Romans like made cakes and how they cooked them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Um, yeah, food, the anthropological aspect of food and cooking is just so fascinating to me.
It is.
And
And what it meant to them, like, like, so today, I don't know, what's kind of coming through to me is this business about the fish that we've been talking, like the red mullet. I feel like if we're doing, like, we're talking about food and the psychopomp and the soul, I feel like red mullet is like our symbol because this has been really interesting to learn about this, the role of this fish in these Hecate suppers because you did some research and you found out like some of the anthropological kind of cultural economic things about this having this specific fish in a meal offered to Hecate.
right, so a red mullet, well, I mean, it wasn't a super common fish. It was actually like highly prized and highly valued. I think I read recently that one red mullet could fetch like three horses at one point in time. But it was this traditional offering for Hecate's Dipnon, as well as sprat. And so we were talking about red mullet versus sprat. And uh, I'm curious to learn about sort of the divide between those two, like because sprat or like sardines basically or herring, it's like a more common fish. And
Mm.
I'm really into like what was the average person offering, because there was a huge social divide between like sort of like the elite and, your average Joe, right? And it being a coastal community. I don't know. It's just been really interesting to dive into.
Yeah, those anthropological aspects and the whole idea, like the whole thing about like the ancient Hecate supper is really fascinating to me and kind of like expanding that to this idea of Hecate's kitchen as a place of soul. So like Hecate's kitchen um, as a place where like those meals were prepared, that certainly her presence would have been felt.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to talk more about specifically Hecate as psychopomp and these suppers and what it meant back then. But it's this whole idea of Hecate's kitchen. There's meals being prepared to honor her on the Dipnon, and then there's also like the fictional stories about like Medea and Samantha and Circe and like crafting their spells and what is easily seen as like the kitchen or the hearth of the home and all of this business around the hearth, so doing like magic in the kitchen and preparing meals in the kitchen and also like the kitchen as like the social and communicative hub of the home. Like if you are, whether you're a very simple family or, you're a very kind of prosperous family with servants and so on in the kitchen, that the kitchen means so much more than just a place where food is prepared. Like it is really like that soul hearth at the home.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the idea of Hecate's kitchen, is really like soulful practice of like, not just like what you might call like kitchen witchery, putting together like an herbal bundle for some kind of talisman, but also like this deep meaning of like what is the soul of the kitchen, and how do we honor ourselves and the goddess and our craft through how we interact with the kitchen, and to see it kind of as like belonging like Hecate's territory, as well as like the garden or the cave or the temple, like her, that is a place where the spirit of Hecate can abide and can help us like return to our own soul in a lot of ways. If that does that make sense?
Yeah, when you say Hecate's kitchen or I say Hecate's kitchen, I don't think of like this outward place where I'm like cooking and I'm doing the things. It's more like this inward outward crossroads, right? Where as within so without, right? Like it's something within me as well as something outward. Like it's that sort of meeting place. Um and I just feel that so strongly, you know. Um
And it's
and
that crossroads between like us here in the present moment, whether we're making like our nanny
mhm,
tea biscuits or whatever we're doing, or we're, creating a meal to
mhm,
honor Hecate based on like the ancient construction of one, or even like if we feel like we're connecting on some soulful levels to like to the spirit of Circe, and
mhm,
doing some botanical magic in the
mhm,
kitchen that I write about in Entering Hecate's Garden. Like, there's so much soul in the kitchen that we can find in different ways, right? And I really like how you say it's like this inward, it's a crossroads
mhm,
that we can come to, and it's something that's inside of us. Hecate's kitchen. It's nourishing. It's bright. It's There's that fire. Yeah, I
mhm,
think even now, I remember years ago, I had a student who had this dream. I think it was before you started in Covina, but maybe not. It was like she had this dream about like standing in front of her electric range.
mhm.
Were you around for this dream?
I don't think I was.
Oh, you'd remember it if you were. And so she was dreaming about like standing in front of this electric range, and trying to figure out how to work it basically. And then someone was there, kind of like in a psychopomp figure role in the dream, like trying to help her work the stove,
Mhm,
almost like. And then and I think it was one of those, like it kept repeating. And
mhm,
so we were talking about it during a class one day, and I was like, well, the electric range, like that's the hearth, that's the fire of the modern home. And literally they were like, oh,
mhm,
gasps. You know what I mean? Because people, it's like we've been that disconnected
mhm,
from like whether we have a gas range or an electric range. Well, I guess the gas range, it's a little bit more obvious, but like I have one of those inductions.
mhm,
And so the fact that the electricity that makes the heat is actually like there's fire involved here along the way. There, like, you know what I mean? Like we can get super removed from seeing the range, the stove as fire, like as the hearth, but it actually is. And in her dream, it was like, oh yeah, once she started to see it as, oh yeah, that's like the soul fire, the home fire, Hecate's fire. It's just coming to you in a modern way. Like, but everybody kind of in the class was like, never thought of the range like that before. So yeah.
Yeah, it's a light bulb moment. And I keep thinking reconnection, reconnection, and like no separation. And I know we keep saying this over and over again, but I can't emphasize it enough that like the hearth of the home was like the heart of the home. And there was no difference. Like there was no separation between food and medicine because food was medicine, you know. Yeah.
Well, that's a really interesting thing to add to the discussion, because I was thinking about this the other day. So we do, I don't know where you and your partner keep like your medicines, like if you have to have pharmaceuticals in the house. But
Mhm.
I've always kept mine like in the kitchen. I don't know why. And then I was thinking, I don't know why I was thinking about this the other day because I started taking a new supplement, and I started thinking like, why do people keep medication in the bathroom? I
I've
have
never
no
thought.
answer. I have no answer for how that. I have not done the historical deep dive on how that practice got started. Like the medicine cabinet is in the bathroom. Like it's so weird because like usually like a lot of things, and then I started to look kind of like around at the different supplements and things that we take, and I was like, most of these say take with food. There is no food in the bathroom,
Mhm. Yeah, that's so strange. Never even considered that.
right? Or at least you have to like drink something to get them down.
Yeah, well, I mean, we keep ours in the kitchen too. I mean, because that's where the drinks are. Like
Right,
this.
that's where the drinks and the food are, and this is where you'll find me hanging out, taking my vitamins. I don't know. Yeah, so like that, I think that's like another layer of separation.
Hmm.
Because even if, it's a prescription from like a doctor, from a, mainstream allopathic doctor, like at some point that started out as a plant.
Hmm.
Like it started out as a potential food source.
Hmm.
It's just we've kind of like everything is so siloed and pigeonholed these days. So at some point, the medicine left the kitchen and walked up the stairs to the bathroom.
Hmm. Cindy, I can feel this key unlocking something through this whole conversation. Like, yeah, yeah, all of the degrees of separation that we're discussing, and this sort of like finding our way back to the kitchen is reclaiming the sacred feminine, right?
It
I don't,
really is.
yeah, yeah,
Because
and
like
there's
that
power in
kitchen,
that. I
right?
think I think it's so ingrained in us to see it as like a sort of servant's role, but there's so much power in it, you know. And people giggle at like at the kitchen witch, but it's like we're making your food. You know what I mean? To like to bring it back to Cersei. I'm joking. But yeah, there's so much power in it. There's so much power in it. And it's so beautiful.
So when we were talking about starting to explore like the meaning of Hecate's kitchen, and we zeroed in on focusing really on doing this kind of social anthropological examination of the ancient Hecate supper, that's where we wanted to start. Well, we did kind of informally start with the cakes for Hecate last summer, which I think unlocked for us like, oh, we want to do this more. Like we want to understand this better, what the history is all about. But for me, when we were talking about this, I was like, I really want to reclaim or elevate kitchen witchery, because I totally agree with you that for whatever, like, well, we know what the reasons are because it's associated with women. Kitchen witchery is like what women do in the kitchen with their
Right.
spoons and their mortar and pestles, and like real magic or real ritual is what the fancy men are doing, or what you do when you go to a church or something. I don't know, for whatever reason, I'm thinking of Freemasons. I don't know why I'm thinking of the Freemasons. You know what I mean? Like that's the real stuff. And then if you're Cersei in the kitchen, with making your potions or your filters, um, that somehow is both nefarious and unimportant, which is an interesting combination when you think about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
She is really dangerous over there. She's not important at all, but whatever she is up to could probably kill us. Like it's a weird combination. It's like when you read different like academic like treatments of Hecate, and not so much now, but it used to be like, say, like in the older ones, like more in the Victorian times, like when the academics there, they would be like, well, she was an unimportant deity, and on the at the end of the month, they would do this supper to her because if they didn't, they would fall out of favor with her and a whole bunch of bad things would happen to him. So if she was so unimportant,
Right.
it's like Zeus was, he was like the supreme guy. And then like they really became infatuated with like Apollo. Talking
Mhm.
about Artemis and Hecate, of course, always gets kind of entwined because in most or many regions of the ancient Mediterranean, there is a lot of synchrony between them. Um, but for like in Attic Greece, kind of in the classical Greek era that we all think of, that really only lasted like a couple hundred years, um, because everything kind of fell apart. That that Hecate there and that small part of the ancient world is the one that is kind of like endured, and that is where like the documentation about Hecate's suppers come from, which lead you raised a really great question about this because these Hecate suppers were done were apotropaic. Can never say that word. Apotropaic. They were designed to curry her favor and get her protection because if you didn't propitiate her and her horde and her restless dead, which were a lot of like dead, unimportant yet nefarious women, um, and other creatures. Like if you didn't get it right, then she would get you. But you raised a really cool point about like what you'd like to know because this is
Yeah,
like a very specific thing. But what we were talking about earlier is interesting.
yeah, it's like, so what I want to know is, you know, like you said, all of the ancient sources that I mean, I've read so far in this sort of atropaic offering and like this um sort of made to appease Hecate's horde or to appease Hecate. And it's like, how, what about the offerings that weren't rooted in fear? What about the offerings that were like rooted in reverence? That's what I'd like to know about. You know.
And then we were talking about how like the Greeks of this era, of this period in time, they that was kind of their mindset, like
Mhm.
towards a lot of the divine, is that it was always like we got to do this sacrifice because
Right.
Zeus gonna get us, and better watch out for Athena. So they were doing things in this kind of like protective sense, not to be
Mhm.
like Hecate is super awesome and I just love her, so I am going to make this beautiful meal. Um, like we just did fish for Hecate,
Mhm.
inspired by the red mullet business. So like I use scallops because scallops are probably the priciest local fish we could get here. So, but I do it because I think she's super awesome and I love her history and experiencing her, and you know what I mean? Like it's a very, I don't fear Hecate, but
Right.
I think back then, it was more common to kind of, especially like chthonic or underworld deities, were more feared because the
Mhm.
underworld meant the afterlife, like like, and this gets into her role as psychopomp, right? So chthonic, like the underworld. So if you're kind of new to all of this ancient Greek history and what are we talking about? So a chthonic deity is a deity. It literally means of the earth. It's not like a demonic deity. Like it's not like Hecate, queen of hell business, because the ancient understanding of the underworld was really different. And most people, when they died, humans went to the underworld. So it's not, there was a part of it, Tartarus, that was like hell, like what we might think of like going to hell. Um, but overall, like they thought that humans went to the underworld. Pluto or Hades was the boss down there.
Mhm.
Persephone was his queen. Hecate had a really special dominion over the underworld where she was also a queen of the underworld, but she like wasn't married to Hades or anything. She kind of went back and forth and did her own business.
Mhm.
Um, and part of her Hecate's business in this version of Hecate that comes from this period in classical Greece, like it's this whole thing that she went back and forth through the underworld. So she was, um, she kind of had her hounds that were like that would protect the way to the underworld, or but she also had this horde,
Mhm.
which really fascinates me. And I also, in the Psychopomp chapter in Entering Hecate's Cave, I talk about the horde. And I think if you're going to be, if you're going to, like, I'm going to spend the day, I'm going to make my kitchen Hecate's kitchen for the day, I'm going to make her a special meal, and I'm going to just take off the time from work, put the pets and the kids and the partner, I'm going to give them notice that, this is my day to kind of really be like Circe, crafting in the kitchen, but also making food in the kitchen. And I'm going to do this whole, like, if you're having one of those days, like, and with the intention of going to a crossroads after dark on the new moon, you have to open yourself up to the idea of Hecate's horde and how, like, and how in this version of Hecate from classical Greece, like how important that horde was to her, which, right?
Yeah, and I think one of the more beautiful aspects of the Dipnon offering is that whole, like you take it to a crossroads and you leave it and you turn around and you don't look back, because it's about trusting that it's going to go where it needs to go, right? Who needs to receive it is going to receive it. And the actual um people, the hungry or like the homeless or the impoverished or something, benefited from that offering as well, I think is really beautiful.
And I think that's a really important aspect to kind of pull out from, like, our kind of anthropological excavation of what these ancient suppers to Hecate meant. It's that there's this symbolic gesture that usually included a sacrifice, like a sacrifice of a dog, usually in the home. And that was like a way to cleanse the house. We'll talk about that maybe some other time. But with the supper, there was this symbolic thing of, if we take this to Hecate and her horde, so her horde were restless spirits, so people that were denied like a proper burial, for different reasons, like they were cast outs of society, or also like spirits that perhaps never knew like mortal flesh,
Mhm.
that were more like, what the Greeks called like daimon, Daimon is the translation, like I use a lot. So like spirits that never were. So Hecate's horde was kind of like this band of, I don't know what it kind of reminds me. I don't know if this is going to be blasphemy, but it kind of reminds me of those New Orleans style funeral processions.
Oh yeah, like the second line sort
Yeah,
of.
the second line, yeah. Like in a loving way, because I think the horde is cool, and I think the second line is really a beautiful ritual too. Um, but so she had this, so there's all this symbolic business, but then there's also the real world where the actual living, breathing cast off of society
Mhm.
would often live like on the fringe of the city or the town or the village. And that would often be where like the crossroads were going out of the village.
Mhm.
And that was also where like the dead who were unable to have like a proper burial, that's where they would be buried. So there were actual like living, breathing humans who occupied spaces near these crossroads and
Mhm.
would undoubtedly benefit from meals being left there.
Mhm.
So it's like this twofold thing of like, well, you're helping the outcast, but not really, because it's for Hecate.
Mhm.
And I've had some interesting conversations with people who kind of see this really differently than you and I over the years, about whether or not the ones who were fortunate enough to be leaving the meals at the crossroads, if they would have been cognizant of the fact that the food would actually be consumed by other people. I really believe like there's no way like ancient they weren't stupid.
Yeah.
Um, but some people are like, no, no, no. Like there was no that wasn't like a kind of double meaning of the whole thing.
Well, I mean, I would imagine maybe that wasn't of utmost important to them. They're probably just concerned with protecting themselves.
Right? Maybe.
Yeah.
Or maybe it was just like, I don't know. Like this is like I know in my mind this makes sense, but you know how like you leave like a meal for Santa,
Uh-huh. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Okay, so if there are small children who believe in Santa listening, you may want to cover their ears. Okay, but there's Santa's not real. But we still leave a meal for Santa, like in many houses, like if you have small children, right?
Yeah.
But as the adult involved in this tomfoolery,
Hmm.
that Santa will not be eating it, and that you, in fact, will probably eat it at some point.
Hmm.
Or it's going to see the inside of the compost bin.
Hmm.
So maybe, I don't know, like, who's to say that maybe they didn't kind of have that double understanding of what was going on? And we're fine with
Maybe
it.
they maybe they did. And that might be a good segue into consuming offerings. Cindy, do you think that's something we should talk about?
Oh, yeah, you want to talk about it? Because I generally do, but not always.
Hmm.
Um, I so what do we know from the record about whether or not these ancient meals, like maybe we should just before we dive into this, let's give them a glimpse into what the actual meal consisted of. Okay,
Okay.
so I am reading from a book that's now out of print by Stephen Ronan. That was his thesis on Hecate. So I'm just going to read a couple of passages because this is kind of like the primary source where our modern thinking about the dipnon comes from. So he says, as is usually the case with offerings to the dead. So right away, he is associating the Hecate's dipnon. Dipnon just means supper. He says it's on the 30th of the month, consisted of food. But by 30th of the month, he actually means the last day of the month. And it for the ones who would have been doing a dipnon on the last day of the month, we know that they followed a lunar calendar and that the last day of the month would have been when the moon was not visible in the sky. Okay, so the specific articles, so far as I mentioned, were Megides, a kind of loaf or cake, the shape, ingredients of which are not clear. Maybe we can get somewhere with that one, Kristen.
Yeah.
The mayonnaise or sprat, which you're starting to work on now, Scarota or garlic, pretty straightforward. The trigle or mullet, we've done a lot. We've talked about the red mullet a lot. The sameta, a sacrificial cake, which we made cakes last year. Eggs, cheese, and possibly the bosanius, which is a different type of cake, which I do think like there is a recipe for that cake. So this is what the basic ingredients according to the sources were for Hecate supper. So he goes on to say, certainly some, perhaps all of the articles of this ceremonial bill of fare, I love that he says it, were thought to possess some peculiar virtue or association commending them to Hecate and her crew. Ancient and widespread, for example, is a belief that the cock is the herald of the sun, and that all vagrant ghosts must obey his summons and return to their place. Possibly this is one of the reasons why eggs are so regularly associated with the cult of the dead. In most cases, however, it is likely that the choice of a given article for a given sacrifice is the cause, not the result, of the properties and associations ascribed to it. The belief, for instance, that garlic was sovereign against vampires was probably the result of, instead of the original reason for, its use. So too, the evident fact that the trigle, or red mullet, was sacred to Hecate is sufficiently explained by religious conservatism. Not that kind, a different kind. Various authorities, quoted by Athenaeus, give reasons for it, but these were evidently second thoughts and due to later theorizing. However that may be, the food thus offers was meant to be prophylactic, to avert the enthumeion, the easily roused wrath of Hecate and the ghost. Hence, if Roscher is correct, the title of Eucaline, given to her by Callimachus, really embodies the worshipper's fervent prayer on these occasions that good digestions wait on appetite. With the regular Hecate's dipnon just described should be included the so-called Catharmata, Catharsia, and Oxuthumia. All three were connected with the purificatory and expiatory sacrifices to Hecate that were performed at regular intervals for the house and the household. They were therefore left at the crossroads for Hecate, and, as was usually the case with offerings made to spirits present and easily angered but invisible, the worshipper had to do this without looking back. Finally, all three, Rhodes suggests, this is another author that he quotes a lot in this, were doubtless more or less confused with each other and with Hecate's dipnon at an early date. In its general sense, Catharmata means garbage, trash of any kind. So it goes on, he talks more about this, like the waste and blood from ritual sacrifices, household sweeping. So, there's a lot of existing detail about what this supper was. And I really like his point. It kind of, like, so he's kind of saying, like, did they know, like, eggs? How did this all get started? So, like, the red mullet has 3 gestational cycles every year. Well, did someone say, well, let's use a red mullet because they're super expensive and definitely they will, give Hecate good digestion so she won't bother us this month? Or was it like someone just happened to have a red mullet and so it kind of got started? Like, isn't that like the 100 monkeys theory or something? Like, you know what I mean? Like more people, like, have you heard of the 100 monkeys theory before?
I haven't heard of it, but I know what you're saying. I know what you're saying.
Like, so if one person does it, but then someone else starts doing it, and finally, when the 100th monkey does it, then it's like just the way things are done. And then, you look back, and then they're like, oh, well, we picked the red mullet because Hecate has 3 forms and it has 3 gestational cycles. So it's kind of like reverse engineering, or was it intentional? So it's kind of playing with these ideas about the different kind of, like, I guess, more folk beliefs around the ingredients in the supper. Like eggs to ward off the dead. Maybe just they had eggs on the table. Who knows?
Yeah, well, there was something I was brought up earlier today. I was thinking about the red mullet and this idea of like the sea being the liminal space between like the mortal realm and the underworld, and that I think in some circles it was believed that maybe fish ferried the dead, and I know that mullet were bottom feeders, and like I think that there might be something there, like this connection with the fish in the sea and the underworld and honoring the dead or appeasing the dead. I think there's something to that.
That it was more intentional than what Ronan kind of drifts into saying, like,
Yeah.
it's more likely these things just kind of happen and then people made up reasons for why they did them.
Yeah. In my head, that makes more sense than it reads 3 times a year. Right.
Right? And, like, and that people would have known about, like that the red mullet was a bottom feeder, and that, obviously that it was expensive, and that it was, like you said, it was very like chthonic. It was in the sea, but also like at the bottom of the sea. And that probably made it harder to catch too. and that
Mhm.
that would have been more like closer to the underworld, closer to the dead, like closer to like
Mhm.
Pluto's watery gate
Mhm.
to the afterlife, and all of the river Styx kind of business. So, I mean, I think it could well have been very intentional and not just some kind of afterthought where people ascribe meaning to what they were doing.
Right, 100%. I mean, you're not gonna offer a fish that's worth three horses for no reason.
Right. Right? I mean, if like I'm sitting, like we're sitting around the house and you're like, you don't know, you've got to go and do some propitiation. Are you going to like just randomly choose the most expensive thing in the house? You might, but generally you're going to give some thought
Yeah.
to it. And again, linking back to like people who wrote, that Hecate was an unimportant goddess, and yet there was this really important practice that was done every month, was part of the calendar, like in this part of, during classical Greece, like it was an actual thing you did
Hmm.
um, for this period of time. And I keep thinking, I don't know, maybe I'm going to bring this up. I keep thinking about this comment that someone made on like one of my YouTube videos recently. And this person just like went through and explained to me 100% how Hecate was a really unimportant deity and all of this stuff. And I keep circling back to that comment because, there's this, well, she was so unimportant, but yet, really, even on the calendar of that time, she had her own night.
Hmm.
Now, I don't know about you, but if I put something on my calendar every month and then like the
Right.
whole society did it every month, it's probably important.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um, and then I like the idea of the ritual waste and the sweepings. And, so like Hecate's kitchen for me is also, I associate the kitchen with like cleaning the house as well, like sweeping the floor, because when I sweep the floors, not very often, but when I do, and I always do the kitchen last, because then I toss everything that I can outside. And you actually have a really beautiful story about
The
just
dog
like the
hair.
whole rebirth, like how like making these kind of like waste offerings actually maybe aren't so like they're not waste things that get reused. You want to share that story?
Yeah, yeah. So something I do as offering is I'll groom my dogs. Like I'll cleanse my space, I'll cleanse myself, and I'll groom my dogs. And so I leave the household waste out at the crossroads next to my house. And I noticed one day that there were birds collecting the dog hair and like building little nests with it. And it was so fascinating that like, to see that like have purpose and like be reused. And it was just, yeah, really, really beautiful.
It's so beautiful, and I've seen the pictures, and it is super. These are like some lovely looking birds' nests. Like the bird, like
They look so cozy.
they look so cozy, like a sweater bird's nest. Um, but I was also thinking after you told that story, I was thinking like something I do without even thinking of it is I take the coffee grinds and like throw them on the garden bed because they're good for the garden.
All right. Mm-hmm.
So, I think a lot of this is just maybe like deconditioning from our idea that what is garbage to us is like we're somehow like potentially like fouling up the world because so much of the garbage in the world is fouling up the world. But it's not like all garbage is destroying the world, like natural garbage, like dog fur and coffee grinds and the compost heap, like
Mm-hmm.
that's a way that gets regenerated. And in the ancient world, like they didn't have like 42 kinds of plastic that were
Right.
taking over the planet. Their approach and understanding of garbage would have been really different than ours.
Mm-hmm.
Like garbage would have been more of a part of everyday life, and there wouldn't have been so much of it. Like I think there's so much garbage. I don't know. Sometimes I really think about. I am kind of obsessive about how much garbage we put out as a family, and I try not to think about like just how much garbage humans are creating these days. And you work in the restaurant industry.
I do. I do. It's a lot of waste and a lot of plastic, and it's pretty unnecessary. Yeah.
I mean, yeah. Though you did make those shrinky dinks out of the plastic last
Oh
time.
yeah.
Oh,
Yeah. Yeah.
we probably have to explain that to people who are listening who may not know what shrinky dinks are.
So apparently this isn't a thing in Canada. You can't get this plastic, but in the U.S., takeout containers and like a lot of salad containers, you get at the supermarket and stuff. They're made out of number 6 plastic. And so that is essentially the same thing as shrinky dinks. If you grew up with shrinky dinks, what that is you can like draw on it with a marker or like paint on it and cut it out, and then you put it in the oven for 3 or 4 minutes or under a heat source, and it'll like shrink to like a third of the size. You can make like little charms and ornaments and stuff. It's a really fun project and a cool way to recycle.
Yeah, and I think that's like an offering to Hecate, right? It's like taking something that is garbage and finding your own soul in it and like
Repurpose.
repurposing it. I'm all in favor of such ecological approaches. So this has kind of been like a meandering kitchen conversation in Hecate's kitchen, talking about where we're kind of at in just starting to explore this new undertaking of ours and how we think it connects to Hecate's psychopomp, the soul guide, and the restless dead, the nefarious dead. There's also that like aspect of like witchcraft is always being like dangerous and associated with this, which I think is something that because witchcraft has become so popular today, that
Mm-hmm.
almost like these aspects of witchcraft being nefarious is something that we're getting more like dissociated from. But I mean, that's
Mm-hmm.
part of like if we're hanging out in Hecate's kitchen talking about all this, we have to kind of understand like this history of witchcraft. Hecate, as leader of the horde, was leading the witches, and it wasn't necessarily something that was viewed positively. Um, and that I just have so much fun reclaiming all of this and
Yes.
finding like myself in all of these stories and practices as someone who's always really felt like the black sheep, not
Mm-hmm.
not offered up for the dip non-slaughter, but the black sheep of the family, that I really find comfort and healing by exploring what some people might find really dark aspects.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I can strongly relate.
I was just going to ask you, does that make sense to you? Like, do you feel a similar way about all of this?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I'm thinking to bring it back to where we started, my own sort of reclaiming. I grew up in a super religious family, of which, like, my grandmother, like I said, and you know about this city a little bit. We had a church camp um, where, like, communal food and ritual and stuff was, like, such a big deal. And there was, I guess, like a wounded part of me that was sort of like ostracized as I grew into myself. And I realized that I was different, and like I was queer and I was a witch and like this whole thing, but something that was like so foundational and like nourishing and fundamental in my world that I got removed from that. And I went back recently and sort of refound myself in that place. And there's definitely a reclaiming happening here. And it's almost beyond words. Like it's hard for me to explain. Yeah, I can relate. 100%.
It really it like feels to me like Hecate and like Circe, that they're somehow like part of my spiritual DNA.
Hmm.
That it feels really ancestral to me in ways that I don't really have the right words to describe. Um, that they feel like family in a sense.
Mhm.
So I hope you have enjoyed our conversation from the table in Hecate's kitchen. I thought I would leave you with this verse from the Psychopomp chapter in Entering Hecate's Cave about leaving a dipnon offering at the crossroads. Hail, Hecate, she who stands at the threshold between the worlds. I bring a fine meal, knowing that it honors you and feeds creatures of this place. They, like me, are yours. I feel the spirits gathered in this place. They, like me, are yours. I am embraced by the darkest night, for the moon has covered her face out of respect for you. They, like me, are yours. Here at your crossroads, I am never alone, nor am I afraid. I am surrounded by my kindred, those who seek your mysteries, and those whom you protect. We are your horde. Hail, Hecate, she who stands at the threshold between worlds. So I hope you have enjoyed hearing us wander through Hecate's kitchen, talking about the ancient dipnon and the different components of it. Like I said, we've done the cakes for Hecate. We just did fish for Hecate. So we'll be throughout this whole year of 2023, we will be studying all of this and sharing more as we go. Bye.
Bye.